There comes a point in personal growth when the goal quietly changes. At first, most people want to be understood. They explain themselves repeatedly, hoping that if they use the right words, everyone will finally see their intentions. They spend enormous energy managing perceptions, correcting misunderstandings, and earning approval. Then something shifts. Not because they become indifferent to people, but because experience teaches them a simple lesson. Clarity is valuable, but not everyone is committed to understanding you. Some people listen to learn. Others listen only long enough to defend the version of reality they already prefer. Once you recognize that difference, your behavior begins to change. Emotional maturity is often mistaken for emotional distance. They are not the same thing. Distance is built from avoidance. Maturity is built from regulation. One hides from discomfort, the other remains steady in the presence of it. Imagine two people receiving the same criticism. One immediately reacts, interrupts, and defends every decision. The other pauses. They ask questions. They separate useful feedback from emotional noise. The second person is not less emotional. They are simply less controlled by the emotion they feel in the moment. That pause is more powerful than it appears. Human beings naturally expect immediate reactions. In conversations, people often reveal more than they intend simply because silence makes them uncomfortable. The individual who becomes comfortable with silence gains an advantage, not because silence is a trick, but because it creates space for better judgment. Decisions made after reflection are generally more reliable than decisions made under souffle pressure. Many conflicts survive because both people believe speed is more important than accuracy. They rush to explain themselves before they fully understand what happened. They defend positions they haven't carefully examined. They answer accusations instead of questions. Emotional discipline interrupts this cycle. It replaces impulsive certainty with deliberate observation. One of the strongest forms of confidence is the ability to remain calm while someone else attempts to create urgency. Pressure often changes the quality of thinking. Deadlines, emotional intensity, and social expectations encourage quick choices. Sometimes quick choices are necessary. Often they are simply convenient for the person applying the pressure. Learning to recognize artificial urgency protects your ability to think independently. Consider how often important decisions are accompanied by phrases like, "You have to decide right now," or, "If you cared, you wouldn't hesitate." Those statements may occasionally reflect genuine circumstances, but they can also discourage thoughtful consideration. Calm people do not confuse another person's urgency with their own responsibility. They gather information, evaluate options, and move deliberately whenever circumstances allow. There is a common misconception that strength always announces itself loudly. In reality, lasting strength is frequently quiet. It doesn't require constant demonstration because it isn't built on external validation. People who trust themselves rarely feel compelled to prove themselves in every conversation. They understand that competence becomes visible through consistent behavior over time, not through repeated declarations. This shift changes communication. Instead of arguing over every misunderstanding, emotionally grounded people become more selective. They ask themselves whether the conversation is likely to produce greater understanding or simply greater conflict. If the discussion has become an exchange of assumptions rather than evidence, they recognize that continuing may not create clarity. Walking away from an unproductive argument is not surrender. Sometimes it is the most rational use of energy. Another change occurs in the way you experience disagreement. Early in life, disagreement often feels personal. Different opinions seem like rejection. As emotional resilience develops, disagreement becomes information. Someone else's perspective may contain useful insight, partial truth, or no practical value at all. The important point is that your identity no longer depends on immediate agreement. You become capable of listening without feeling threatened. This ability creates an unexpected benefit. People often reveal their reasoning more completely when they don't feel attacked. Instead of preparing your next response while they're still speaking, you become genuinely curious about how they reach their conclusion. Curiosity doesn't require agreement. It simply delays judgment long enough to gather better information. Another transformation involves expectations. Many people unknowingly create frustration by expecting others to communicate exactly as they would. When those expectations aren't met, disappointment follows. Emotional maturity replaces assumption with observation. Rather than expecting consistency from everyone, you learn each person's patterns individually. You stop asking why someone behaves differently from you and begin asking how they typically behave across situations. This small adjustment dramatically improves accuracy. Instead of evaluating isolated moments, you notice recurring tendencies. Is this person consistently reliable? Do they usually follow through? How do they respond under stress? Do they become more honest or more defensive when challenged? Patterns answer these questions far better than first impressions. Another overlooked aspect of resilience is the willingness to disappoint people when necessary. This does not mean becoming unkind or dismissive. It means accepting that every meaningful boundary excludes something. Saying yes to one priority inevitably means saying no to another. Individuals who attempt to satisfy every expectation eventually discover they have abandoned many of their own. Boundaries often feel uncomfortable at first because they interrupt familiar dynamics. People who benefited from unrestricted access to your time or attention may initially resist the change. That resistance doesn't automatically make them unreasonable. Change requires adjustment. The important observation is what happens after the adjustment period. Healthy relationships adapt. They find new ways to connect without demanding the abandonment of your priorities. There is another reason calm becomes increasingly valuable as you grow. Calm protects perception. Strong emotion naturally narrows attention. Under stress, people focus intensely on immediate threats while overlooking broader context. This response is useful in emergencies, but less helpful during complex social interactions where subtle details matter. Remaining composed allows you to notice inconsistencies, ask better questions, and avoid unnecessary conclusions. Think about the conversations that influenced your life most positively. They were probably not the loudest conversations. They were likely the ones where someone listened carefully, responded thoughtfully, and encouraged deeper thinking rather than immediate reaction. Wisdom often arrives quietly because it is more interested in understanding than in performance. Confidence also changes your relationship with uncertainty. Instead of demanding guarantees before acting, you become comfortable making decisions with incomplete information. Every meaningful choice contains uncertainty. Careers, relationships, creative projects, and personal goals all require action before every variable is known. The emotionally resilient individual does not eliminate uncertainty. They simply become more capable of functioning within it. Perhaps the greatest transformation is invisible to everyone except you. The need to explain every decision slowly disappears. You stop assuming that every misunderstanding requires correction. You recognize that some people will misinterpret your intentions regardless of how carefully you communicate. Instead of exhausting yourself pursuing universal approval, you invest your effort where mutual understanding is actually possible. Ironically, this often improves relationships rather than weakening them. Conversations become more honest because they are no longer driven by fear of rejection. Decisions become clearer because they are based on values instead of momentary pressure. You become more approachable not because you reveal every thought, but because your words and actions remain consistent over time. The quietest form of confidence is not found in appearing unshakable. It is found in recovering quickly. Life will continue to present criticism, setbacks, misunderstandings, and unexpected change. Emotional resilience does not prevent those experiences. It changes your response to them. Instead of asking, "How do I avoid discomfort?" you begin asking, "What does this situation require from me now?" That single question redirects attention from emotion toward action, from assumption toward observation, and from fear toward deliberate choice. As that way of thinking becomes habitual, something subtle begins to happen. You stop measuring your progress by how intensely you feel, and start measuring it by how consistently you act. Anyone can appear composed when life is predictable. The real test arrives when expectations collapse, when plans fail, or when someone challenges your judgment. Those moments reveal whether calm is merely a temporary mood or a practiced skill. One of the greatest misconceptions about emotional strength is that it requires suppressing emotion. Suppression and regulation are not the same. Suppression attempts to erase an emotion. Regulation allows the emotion to exist without allowing it to dictate behavior. You might feel disappointed, frustrated, or anxious while still choosing actions aligned with your long-term values. That distinction matters because emotions provide information, but they are not always reliable instructions. Consider how often temporary emotions encourage permanent decisions. A single moment of embarrassment can tempt someone to abandon a worthwhile goal. A burst of anger can damage a relationship that took years to build. Fear can convince a capable person to remain in familiar circumstances long after growth requires change. Emotional resilience does not eliminate these impulses. It simply creates enough space between the feeling and the response to make a wiser choice. Another shift occurs in the way you interpret silence. Many people instinctively fill silence with assumptions. A delayed response becomes rejection. A brief message becomes disrespect. A thoughtful pause becomes uncertainty. In reality, silence often contains far less information than people imagine. Emotionally grounded individuals become cautious about assigning meaning where evidence is limited. They recognize that uncertainty is uncomfortable, but discomfort alone does not justify a conclusion. This habit reduces unnecessary conflict because many disagreements begin not with facts, but with interpretations. One person assumes intention. The other assumes misunderstanding. By slowing the process of interpretation, you reduce the number of problems created entirely by speculation. There is also a noticeable difference in how emotionally resilient people approach influence. They understand that lasting influence rarely comes from domination. It comes from credibility. Credibility develops when words consistently match actions over time. People naturally trust those whose behavior remains stable across changing circumstances. Consistency communicates reliability more effectively than promises ever could. Think about the individuals whose advice carries the greatest weight in your life. It is probably not because they always tell you what you want to hear. It is because they have repeatedly demonstrated sound judgment. Their opinions matter because experience has shown that their actions support their words. Trust grows through repeated evidence, not isolated impressions. Another important development is learning to distinguish attention from respect. These two ideas are frequently confused. Attention can be gained through controversy, emotional intensity, or dramatic behavior. Respect develops more slowly. It is earned through competence, integrity, and consistency. Chasing attention often produces short-term recognition. Building respect requires patience because it depends on accumulated experience rather than immediate reaction. This understanding changes communication. Instead of speaking simply to be noticed, you begin speaking when you have something meaningful to contribute. Instead of responding to every criticism, you evaluate whether the criticism deserves your attention. Some feedback deserves careful consideration. Some deserves polite acknowledgement. Some deserves no response at all. Discernment becomes one of the most valuable forms of self-control. It is not enough to know how to respond well. You must also know when a response serves no useful purpose. Every conversation carries an opportunity cost. Time spent defending yourself unnecessarily cannot be invested in improving yourself. This realization gradually shifts your priorities from appearing competent to becoming competent. Another subtle transformation involves identity. Many people build their identity around roles, achievements, or the approval of specific groups. While these things can be meaningful, they are also vulnerable to change. Careers evolve, relationships change, public opinion shifts. If your sense of self depends entirely on external circumstances, stability becomes difficult to maintain. Emotional resilience encourages a different foundation. Instead of asking, "Who am I?" when everything goes according to plan, it asks, "What principles remain true regardless of circumstance?" Integrity, curiosity, discipline, humility, and responsibility remain available, even when outcomes become uncertain. Anchoring identity to values rather than temporary success creates greater psychological stability. Another lesson appears when dealing with criticism. Constructive criticism identifies behaviors that can improve. Destructive criticism often attacks character without offering direction. Learning to distinguish between these forms of feedback prevents two common mistakes. The first is rejecting valuable advice because it feels uncomfortable. The second is accepting unfair judgment simply because it is delivered confidently. Confidence is not evidence. Certainty is not evidence. Volume is not evidence. Behavioral observation repeatedly reminds us that conviction and accuracy are separate things. People can express incorrect ideas with complete certainty. They can also express valuable insights with humility and caution. Evaluating information based on its quality, rather than the confidence with which it is couched, is a habit that protects independent thinking. As emotional maturity develops, your relationship with uncertainty becomes noticeably different. Instead of viewing uncertainty as a threat, you begin treating it as a natural condition of complex decisions. Waiting for perfect clarity often becomes another form of avoidance. Preparation matters. Reflection matters. But eventually there comes a point where additional thinking produces diminishing returns. At that moment, action becomes the teacher that analysis can no longer replace. Another characteristic of emotionally grounded people is their willingness to revise their opinions. Changing your mind after receiving better information is not inconsistency. It is intellectual honesty. Rigidity often appears strong on the surface, yet genuine confidence has little fear of correction. When your identity is tied to always being right, learning becomes difficult. When your identity is tied to pursuing truth, adjustment becomes a sign of growth rather than weakness. This perspective also influences relationships. Instead of searching for people who always agree with you, you begin valuing people who challenge your thinking respectfully. Agreement feels comfortable. Honest dialogue promotes development. The strongest relationships often contain both encouragement and accountability because they are built on mutual respect rather than constant validation. Over time, you may notice that your emotional world becomes quieter, not because life has become easier, but because your internal responses have become more deliberate. Situations that once demanded immediate reaction now invite careful observation. Conversations that once consumed your attention now occupy only the time they deserve. You become less interested in winning every interaction and more interested in understanding which interactions genuinely contribute to a meaningful life. That quiet should never be confused with indifference. It is the result of learning that energy is finite. Every unnecessary argument, every imagined slight, every attempt to manage another person's perception consumes attention that could be invested elsewhere. By choosing your responses deliberately, you preserve that attention for the people, principles, and goals that truly matter. Over time, this steady discipline becomes one of the clearest expressions of emotional strength. Not because it makes you unreachable, but because it makes you intentionally present where your presence has the greatest value. Eventually, you begin to notice a pattern that has little to do with other people, and almost everything to do with yourself. The situations that once pulled you into emotional turbulence begin to lose their grip. Not because the world has become kinder or more predictable, but because your attention is no longer automatically captured by every unexpected event. You become more deliberate about where your focus goes, understanding that attention is one of your most valuable resources. Every day presents countless opportunities to react. A careless remark, an unexpected delay, an unfair comparison, a misunderstood message, each one invites an emotional response. The invitation itself is not the problem. The question is whether every invitation deserves acceptance. Emotional maturity often begins with recognizing that not every challenge requires participation. There is a quiet confidence that develops when you no longer feel responsible for correcting every misconception. Many people spend years trying to ensure they are perfectly understood by everyone they meet. It is an impossible objective because understanding depends not only on what is said, but also on what the other person is prepared to hear. Two individuals can witness the same event and leave with entirely different interpretations, because each filters the experience through different expectations, memories, and assumptions. Once you appreciate this reality, your communication changes. You still value clarity, you still speak honestly, but you stop measuring your success by whether everyone agrees with your intentions. Your responsibility is to communicate with integrity. Their interpretation remains influenced by factors you cannot fully control. This perspective reduces unnecessary emotional exhaustion. Instead of revisiting conversations repeatedly in search of the perfect explanation, you begin asking a more practical question. Have I communicated clearly and respectfully? If the answer is yes, endless revision rarely produces additional understanding. At some point, the healthiest choice is to allow your consistent actions over time to speak more loudly than repeated justification. Another meaningful shift involves your relationship with approval. Approval feels rewarding because it signals acceptance within a group. There is nothing inherently wrong with appreciating encouragement. The difficulty arises when approval becomes the primary guide for decision-making. If every important choice depends on immediate acceptance, independence becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Emotionally resilient individuals gradually reverse this order. Instead of asking, "Will everyone approve?" they ask, "Is this decision consistent with my principles?" Approval becomes welcome but optional. Integrity becomes essential. This distinction becomes especially important during periods of transition. Growth often requires temporary misunderstanding. Learning a new skill, changing careers, establishing healthier routines, or redefining relationships may not immediately make sense to those who only see the surface of your decisions. Waiting for universal approval before making necessary changes can delay progress indefinitely. Another pattern worth recognizing is the difference between observation and assumption. Observation says, "The meeting started 20 minutes late." Assumption says, "They don't respect my time." Observation says, "They disagreed with my proposal." Assumption says, "They want me to fail." The first describes events. The second assigns hidden motives. Maintaining this distinction protects both your judgment and your relationships. Human beings naturally seek explanations for behavior, especially behavior that affects them emotionally. But explanations are often incomplete. The more comfortable you become acknowledging uncertainty, the less likely you are to fill informational gaps with inaccurate conclusions. This habit does not make you passive. Quite the opposite. It allows your decisions to be based on stronger evidence. When action becomes necessary, you act from understanding rather than impulse. There is another quality that becomes increasingly valuable as emotional resilience develops: patience. Modern environments encourage immediate reactions. Messages are answered instantly. Opinions are formed rapidly. Judgments spread quickly. Patience interrupts this momentum. It allows facts to emerge before conclusions become permanent. Consider how many conflicts would disappear if people delayed their first interpretation by even a few hours. Temporary frustration often creates explanations that later prove inaccurate. Time does not solve every problem, but it frequently improves perspective. Another overlooked characteristic of emotionally grounded people is their willingness to remain students. Experience creates confidence, but confidence must never eliminate curiosity. The moment someone believes there is nothing left to learn, observation begins to decline. Assumptions quietly replace evidence. Curiosity keeps perception flexible. It encourages questions instead of premature certainty. It allows new information to modify previous beliefs without threatening personal identity. This intellectual flexibility is not weakness. It is one of the foundations of sound judgment. Relationships also become simpler when you stop expecting perfection from yourself and others. High standards remain valuable, but perfection creates impossible expectations. Everyone occasionally communicates poorly, misjudges situations, or reacts emotionally under pressure. Recognizing this reality allows accountability to exist alongside compassion. Accountability without compassion becomes harsh. Compassion without accountability becomes permissive. Emotional maturity seeks a balance between these two qualities. It acknowledges mistakes while remaining committed to improvement. One final transformation often surprises people. As your internal stability increases, your external behavior may appear less dramatic than before. You celebrate successes with gratitude rather than superiority. You face setbacks with reflection rather than panic. Your confidence becomes quieter because it no longer depends on constant reinforcement. Others may mistake this calm for emotional distance, when in reality, it reflects emotional steadiness. Steadiness should never be confused with indifference. You still care deeply about meaningful work, trusted relationships, and personal growth. The difference is that your emotional investment becomes more intentional. You no longer distribute equal attention to every distraction, every criticism, or every passing opinion. Instead, you reserve your energy for the people and pursuits that align with your values. Over months and years, these seemingly small choices accumulate. Each deliberate response strengthens the habit of thoughtful action. Each unnecessary conflict you decline creates more space for meaningful progress. Each moment of patient observation improves the accuracy of your judgment. Eventually, emotional resilience is no longer something you consciously practice in every situation. It becomes part of the way you naturally move through the world. Calm not because nothing challenges you, but because your decisions are guided less by immediate emotion and more by clarity, evidence, and purpose. There is a point where emotional discipline stops feeling like effort and starts becoming your default setting. At first, remaining composed requires conscious attention. You remind yourself to pause before speaking, to question your first interpretation, to resist the temptation to react immediately. Over time, those reminders become habits. The gap between stimulus and response naturally widens, and inside that gap lives one of the most valuable forms of freedom a person can develop. The freedom to choose, rather than simply react. Most people underestimate how much of their daily behavior is automatic. Familiar situations trigger familiar responses. A certain tone of voice creates defensiveness. A specific criticism produces self-doubt. An unexpected compliment encourages overconfidence. The mind loves efficiency, and habits provide it. Yet habits do not distinguish between those that serve you and those that quietly limit your potential. Emotional growth often begins with recognizing these automatic patterns before attempting to change them. Imagine observing your own behavior as if you were studying someone else. Which situations consistently produce impatience? Which conversations leave you mentally exhausted? Which environments encourage your best thinking? Stepping into the role of observer creates psychological distance. That distance reduces emotional intensity just enough to allow more objective evaluation. This practice also reveals something surprising. Many frustrations repeat themselves because the underlying pattern remains unchanged. The names, locations, and circumstances may differ, but the structure is remarkably similar. Perhaps you repeatedly agree to responsibilities you do not have time to fulfill. Perhaps you continue seeking reassurance from people who rarely provide it. Perhaps you postpone difficult conversations until the accumulated tension becomes impossible to ignore. Once patterns become visible, change becomes practical rather than mysterious. There is another advantage to becoming more observant. You begin distinguishing between what demands action and what merely demands attention. Modern life presents an endless stream of information competing for mental space. Not every headline deserves concern. Not every opinion deserves analysis. Not every disagreement deserves resolution. Discernment becomes the ability to separate importance from immediacy. This distinction protects mental energy. Urgent events naturally attract attention, but urgency alone does not determine significance. Some of the most meaningful developments in life occur quietly through consistent habits, rather than dramatic moments. Daily reading appears insignificant compared with a major achievement, yet years of disciplined learning often create the foundation upon which that achievement rests. Emotional resilience also changes your experience of uncertainty. Instead of interpreting uncertainty as evidence that something is wrong, you begin recognizing it as an unavoidable feature of meaningful decisions. Every worthwhile pursuit contains variables beyond your control. Waiting for complete certainty often becomes another way of postponing action indefinitely. This does not encourage recklessness. Preparation remains essential. Thoughtful planning reduces unnecessary risk. The difference is that emotionally grounded individuals accept that preparation eventually reaches a point where experience becomes the only remaining teacher. Knowledge accumulated through action often surpasses knowledge accumulated through endless speculation. Another subtle change involves your relationship with mistakes. Many people interpret mistakes as verdicts on their ability. A single failure becomes evidence that they lack talent or potential. This interpretation discourages experimentation because every attempt appears to threaten personal identity. Emotional maturity reframes mistakes differently. Errors become feedback about methods rather than definitions of character. This perspective encourages continuous improvement. Instead of asking, "What does this failure say about me?" you begin asking, "What does this outcome reveal about my approach?" The first question often creates shame. The second encourages learning. Curiosity consistently produces better long-term results than self-condemnation. Notice, too, how your conversations begin to change. You become less interested in proving yourself right and more interested in discovering what is accurate. These goals occasionally overlap, but they are not identical. A person focused primarily on being right may ignore valuable evidence simply because accepting it would require changing position. Someone focused on understanding welcomes new information because improvement matters.